I was going to talk mainly about putting globalization in historical perspective, but I really I think there's a lot of interest in Trump. And Trump is changing history. So I'm going to sort of deal with both of those topics. And I think they fit in very well with what we've just seen and some of the historic changes in Eastern Europe in terms of opening up to trade, privatizing, and things of that sort, and what we're going to see afterwards about socialism and the role of socialism in recent history. So globalization in retreat, that's sort of the big question. And the subsidiary question is the US driving this process now with Trump? So here's just some bullet points for the first half hour or so. We are coming off a remarkable period in history, and I want to show you just how remarkable your life span has been in terms of the changes in the world economy. Historically unprecedented. The past drivers of globalization have stalled. So we are in a new era. We're in a new era too, not just economically, but geopolitically. And geopolitics has major implications for the future of the world economy. And I think to understand where we are with Trump and how historic it is, the nature of the changes he's bringing about, we have to understand and appreciate where we've been. And that's a little bit what we just saw about Slovakia and other things like that. So I have many favorite charts. This is one of my favorite charts. This is the history of the world for the past 200 years, from an economist standpoint and looking at the world economy. This is the world trade to GDP ratio. The ratio of world trade to GDP. In other words, how important is trade in the world economy? Obviously, if it's small, that means the world is not really well integrated in terms of trade. And so this gets back to what I was talking yesterday about free trade and protection and whether countries are open to trade or not. Is this your phone by any chance?
Let me finish my 10 commandments.
Yeah, there you go.
Joking.
So this goes back just about as far as we have data for the world trade GDP after the Napoleonic Wars up to the present. And what there's some big dividing lines, some big historical changes. And it divides globalization into 5 eras. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Go through them quickly. The first era is what we call the long 19th century, from about 1815 to World War I. And what you can see is the world trade to GDP ratio is gradually rising. And there are 2 factors driving globalization forward. What do you think they are? The Industrial Revolution. So reducing transport costs, reducing the cost of moving goods between markets. So we have the steamship, we have railroads. Railroads were moving grain from Ukraine to Western Europe and from Illinois, United States, to the East Coast where it could be exported. So grain prices were collapsing because you had big supplies coming onto the world market in Western Europe. And also policy. I mentioned some obscure thing yesterday, the Cobden-Chevalier Treaty. I don't know if you remember that. Richard Cobden, Britain, and Chevalier in France agreeing Britain and France would now start cooperating. That led to a whole bunch of other trade agreements in Western Europe that began to reduce tariffs and propelled this gradual rise in period 1. Boom, we have World War I. Okay, wars are not good for commerce. A lot of government intervention in trade too. Then it's followed by the 1920s, which is a very difficult reconstruction period. And then what happens in the 1930s? 29. Stock market crash in 29. Great Depression. And that leads to more protectionism in the US and elsewhere. There's something called the Smoot-Hawley tariff. Tariff rates go way up. I'll show you that in a moment. Other countries adopt trade barriers. And what you can see is, look at how low this goes. It's just falling. The 1920s into the 1930s. And what happens in the 1939? Second World War. That's not good for trade either. Boom, it pushes global integration down further. So we get to the end of the war and we're way back to where we were in 1830 in terms of global integration. So all that growth had just been squashed. And then of course we have the bounce back. And then we have this third period here where there's this gradual rise. But even here, by 1974 or so, this is the oil price shock, 74, we're still not back to where we were, well, we're back to here. We hadn't reached this, gone back to our pre-war peak. And also the world was divided, as I'll show you in a moment, geopolitically. We had three worlds. I'll get to that in a moment. And then we have those oil price shocks. Then we have era 4. I'll get to that in a moment. Here's just sort of the geopolitics of it, and it matters. So in long 19th century, Britain was the strongest power. And of course, there were wars during this period, but Britain sort of ruled the waves. Britannia ruled the waves. They were the large power and provided a system where trade could take place, freedom of the seas. We didn't have that in the interwar period. There's German militarism, 2 world wars. Britain wasn't as strong. The US wasn't exerting leadership. And so the world economy was fragmented. We had US leadership after 1945, but there was the Soviet Union. So there was geopolitical conflict that kept the world divided. Here's how the world was divided. It was 1985 or so, and before, 3 worlds. The first world of North America, Western Europe, Japan, and a few others, mainly market-oriented democracies. The second world, in red, communism, socialism, Soviet Union, China, Eastern Europe, Vietnam, other satellite countries. They couldn't trade very much. They didn't trade very much with the West. Trade was very limited, so the world economy was not integrated. Then the third world, that's the global south, Latin America, South Asia, Africa, they were protecting their industries. They had high levels of protection. So we talked about free trade last time. They didn't believe in free trade. They thought free trade meant the West would exploit them. Just as they had, because they were colonies, they'll be exploited economically. So they kept trade barriers very high. So the world economy was in 3 parts. And that's why that level of integration wasn't very high. And then, of course, we have 1989. That's what we just heard about, the huge economic ramifications of that. So even, liberalization in Eastern Europe, breakup of the Soviet Union, China opens up, of course, a little bit before then. We talked about Deng Xiaoping. And think about how the world changed between 1985 and 1995. 1985, I said there are 3 worlds. 1995, everyone wants to be a member of the World Trade Organization. Everyone wants, more or less, markets and integration and be a part of the EU and open up to trade. Sometimes it's called the Washington Consensus. Sometimes it's called neoliberalism, usually with a sneer as a put down. I think neoliberalism is great because it meant more economic freedom. And all countries are sort of open for business now, in some sense. And that's when we get this period 4. This dramatic rise in global integration, way higher than we achieved right before World War I. Because now it's all continents in the earth participating in global commerce to some extent. And here's what's fueling it. And this is what we just heard about, what was going on in Slovakia, Slovenia, Hungary, Poland, the Baltics, opening up. So this is just the number of trade liberalization episodes where countries are moving from closed markets to open markets. And notice, what happens in the 1960s? Not much. What happens in the 1970s? Not much. What happens in the early 1980s? Not much. But between 1985 and 1995, one after another, countries are saying, we want to open up to trade. We're going to move towards freer trade. And it's a fascinating story how that took place because politically it's a very difficult thing to do. And then, of course, it sort of drops off after 1995. And so we'll talk about tariffs. Tariffs are taxes on imports. That's one measure of how much you're restricting trade. Developing countries in 1980 had very high tariffs, on average 30% or if not more. And gradually they're bringing them down to US levels, EU levels, and levels in other advanced economies that had relatively low tariffs. So that means that's sort of part of that process of opening up. So that's why we get this run up here. And let me just, before we get to this last part, let's talk about what is the implication of that big increase in globalization between 1985 and the financial crisis of 2009. Historic changes in world income distribution as a result in your lifetime. So here is a picture of the world income distribution in the 1800. That's sort of when we started our pictures of globalization, 1800. And what can I don't know if you can see this, maybe you can see it on the screens better there. There's the international poverty line is drawn there. Are more people on the right-hand side of that distribution or on the left-hand side? Left. Okay? Here's the line. Most people are poor. Is the world rich in 1800? No. Most people, food, clothing is just the basics you're trying to get by. And there's a little tail on the right because we hadn't had the Industrial Revolution. It was just starting in Britain. There's the Netherlands and a few others. How does the world look like in 1975, 175 years later? Well, we have two worlds, rich and poor. If you industrialized and you got the Industrial Revolution, incomes rose. Why? Well, Adam Smith would know why. Division of labor, productivity. That's what mechanization is buying for you. It makes labor more productive. You have higher incomes. But most countries were not that way. They're still on the left-hand side. And of course, the world population is bigger. So you had Western Europe and North America, and then you had Africa and Latin America and South Asia. And remember, what were the two countries that were really big that had low incomes? China and India. So you got 2 billion people right there, very poor at low levels. Yes?
Absolutely, the poor line, is it about absolute poverty or like in contrast to...
It's in constant dollars, so it's trying to measure those. You know, you can draw the line anywhere you want, but try to keep it constant, consistent over time. So this is what's happening to global inequality. It's going in one direction, up. Haves and have-nots, rich and poor. Okay, this is just the Gini coefficient for the world. It's going up for 150 years or more. Okay, but then we said 1989, there's a revolution. Countries begin to open up. What happens to world income distribution? All of a sudden, industrialization spreads, technology spreads. As workers become more efficient in China and India, what's going to happen? They're going to get richer. They're going to get richer because they're going to be more productive. And here's where we get, is this a zero-sum game? Are they extracting wealth from other countries? No. We saw that before in those charts. You know, the US gets higher and higher and higher because it becomes more efficient. So what happens is it's not as though the people on the right-hand side, they go down and switch places. It's the whole distribution shifts to the right. It's astounding what happened since 1980 or 1975 here in terms of this distribution, moving these people up and out of poverty as the world is changing. What happens to global inequality? This is mind-blowing. For the first time in recorded human history, global inequality is reduced. What are the two countries mainly driving that? That's the answer right there. You have 2 billion people. They have better technology because they're now part of the world economy. They're going to get richer. They're going to grow at 10% a year for a while. That means they're catching up, which means the gap is closing. We erased a century worth of growing inequality in 20 years after what happened in 1989-91, the liberalization. So that's the world in which you've sort of come into. And it's such a good news story in some sense, right? Reducing global poverty. What city is this? Oh, first of all, what year is it? 1960. 1960. What city do you think this is? Eastern Europe? Somewhere? Africa? India?
Or in India.
Okay. It is the great reveal, Seoul, Korea. What are the people doing? Okay. What does South Korea do today? They export Samsung washing machines and dryers. So a lot of the washing machines and dryers sold. So they've gone from washing clothes in the river running through downtown Seoul to exporting machinery that does that. This is Seoul in 1960. One of the poorest places. There's a debate about whether standards of living were lower than in Africa. Regardless of, it was a very poor place. And of course, they just had the Korean War, which set them back. This is the same river today. Now, this is dramatic, of course, and it hasn't been replicated all over the world. Not all the world's like South Korea and gone from South Korea, but a lot of people have gotten so much better off. You could show similar pictures for India. It's not quite as dramatic. You could certainly show them for China. It would be hugely dramatic. And that's that process that we've seen. That's Seoul today, of course. Here's global poverty, just by head count. How many people? And absolutely, it's not just the share of the world population is less poor. It's the absolute number of people in extreme poverty has gone down by 1 billion people. Of course, where has that mainly taken place? In the red area, East Asia and the Pacific. That's mainly China, but it's also Vietnam, other countries in Southeast Asia. Indonesia has made great progress. The tan in the middle, that's South Asia, so that's India. So still a lot of poor people. What is the last frontier for globalization? Africa. It's the least globalized continent in some sense. It's going to be, I think, in your lifetime, much more important because there's growing population there, whereas it's declining in North America and Western Europe and some Asian countries, China, for example. And so that the dent in poverty has not taken place in Africa. But there has been huge progress. So this is a snapshot of global poverty in 1993. And let's go forward 20 years. And of course, you can see China and India, the two big ones, really big. Boom, 2013. Unfortunately, I haven't updated this. But it's just, that's the reduction in poverty. And once again, you can see lots of progress in Southeast Asia, too. Africa in yellow, not so much. But that's a lot of progress in your lifetime. Huge amount of change. And the question is, are we going to continue on this path or not? This neoliberal era, this era of the Washington Consensus, where countries are adopting markets, I'd say, first of all, it's a historically unique period in human history, where we've had this much change in terms of global income distribution and what have you. Impressive global growth, convergence, poverty reduction, what have you. There's always a caveat. And what's the caveat here? I sort of hinted at it before. What was the era of the first globalization? Industrial Revolution. And Britain was sort of providing global stability. Who provided global stability in the 1920s and 30s? Nobody. Who provided global stability after World War II? United States. So what's going on in this period here between in the 1990s and 2000s? The end of history. There's no challenge to the US. Political scientists call a unipolar moment. The US is in charge and that's it. So here that period depended on benign geopolitics. And two big rivals, China was not focused on expanding its influence around the world. They're just trying to get rich, get their act together. Russia didn't have the stability that Slovakia had, and is just trying to stabilize. Now we're in a situation where both those countries have sort of moved beyond that, and the U.S. seems to be retreating in many ways. So here's this, there's Making the Unipolar Moment, its whole book on the geopolitics of this period here. But here's this last period. Notice what happens. Is globalization still going up? No. And it hasn't been for some time, since the financial crisis in 2008, 2009. And it's been flat. So it's gone up and down, but it's not going up anymore. In fact, I could update this. The next, it goes down a bit. The next dot would be right about here or so. So we're in this era of peak globalization. Globalization sort of topped off. And what does this mean? Well, it means China is not growing at 10% a year anymore. I think we just saw something the other day that's 4% or so, something like that. That's pretty low compared to where they've been. So this era of rapid growth is behind us. And of course, geopolitics has changed, and now the US is changing. So here's sort of the segue to Trump, if you would. What's going on here? This is a picture of US tariffs. Historically, the US has not been a free trade country. You know, you might think we've always sort of embraced free markets and small government to some extent, but we've always been sort of a protectionist country. This is the average tax on imports. And what are the numbers? 30, 40, 50%. Pretty high. This is the 1930s. Look at the tariff here on duty bill imports going up to almost 60%. That's the Smoot-Hawley tariff. So the US has these pretty high tariffs, but what happens after that? Zoom. Goes way down, and it stays low. And it falls in the 70s and the 80s. So there's trade liberalization. The US is an open market. We've moved towards freer trade, and the rest of the world was coming along with us. But now what's happened? President Trump is around. He likes tariffs. And since he's followed through now, well, actually he hasn't followed through with the 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico, America's two largest trading partners. When he does, if he does, this is going to go back up to where we were in the 1940s. And guess what? He's promised tariffs against the European Union. You have to tack those on too. And maybe more tariffs on China and other countries. So we're going up. We're probably not going up to there, but you never know. But certainly there's a directional change in US policy. The US is no longer sort of this open country, and we're not sort of leading international negotiations to reduce tariffs so much. So that's the history that sets us up for what we are going to talk about now, Trump and tariffs. But before we get into developments in the US, any questions about that history? Yes?
Often, arguments against tariffs talk about the retaliatory effect and how once you've made a raise, the other side makes a raise, you have to raise again, what have you. But the peaks in American tariffs were in fact very sudden. So is the expectation now that the expected rise will be like this, going up and up, or is this going to be one peak and then the world will respond somehow in kind and things will eventually go back down?
So this is, first of all, just the US tariff. So it's not in the rest of the world. There has been, as we'll see, retaliation against the US. Certainly, that peak there in 1930, that led to a lot of retaliation against the United States. So that starts this trade war that sets trade on a downward spiral. So I guess the question for today is, are things so as extreme as they were in the Great Depression, where the US tariffs go up, other countries follow, and then you just get into this dynamic where it's very hard to extract yourself from. So I'm not going to speculate too much. Once again, I don't think we're going up to where we had been in the past, but we could go up a little bit further than what those projections are showing. Yeah.
We've been somebody that was able to enforce free trade. So in the 19th century it was Britain,
Yep.
in the 20th century it was America.
Yep.
But in other words, America is subsidizing for the whole world for free trade. And that creates a lot of deficit for American citizens for the whole world to trade. I'm a little bit interested to understand if America will always be paying this price, and shouldn't also other parts of the world participate in protecting the free trade?
Yes, I think this is sort of what we'll get to when we talk about Trump. Trump is definitely a backlash to some extent against that whole era, because there have been segments of the American population, regions of the US that have not flourished as a result of this opening, whereas other regions have. I think on balance it's been very good for the US, but there are some groups that don't think that way, and he's reflecting them. But here's, go ahead.
Because of the security of all of this thing, I mean, it can't be that America will be the one that's providing.
Yeah, but they are benefiting from that. I mean, they provide the infrastructure, so they are benefiting from that.
Well, that's sort of the disruption that Trump is providing. So in some sense, he's saying to Europe, look, you have to defend yourself, right? We've been bearing the burden. You can enjoy a large welfare state, whereas we have a smaller welfare state but higher defense spending. We've been subsidizing you implicitly. Time to rebalance. So that would be a positive spin in some sense. He's trying to get other countries to up their game in terms of defense and trade and other things like that. Okay. Any other questions?
Yeah. I wanted to ask about the effect of COVID, specifically about consolidating production in certain countries to make production more robust. And what is the effect of COVID on that?
We'll talk about that, I think, coming up.
Doug, your slides are going crazy.
Hard to guess.
Your slides are.
Oh, I can't drink and do this thing. Okay, Trump. Let's try to understand him for a minute here, and what he's doing, and whether he's going to achieve his objectives. The first thing to note is all the views that he's expressing now are not new. Go back to the 1980s, he's saying exactly the same thing. He was not a politician back then. He didn't seem to care about politics, but he took out a full-page ad in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal in 1987 complaining about U.S. allies who were not paying their fair share of the defense bill, as you were just saying, and harming our workers by sending a lot of goods when we're not exporting to them. So complaining about Japan automobiles and trade and unfair trade practices. So it's mainly defense, but he talks about trade as well in that. Here he is in TV. Actually, this is a Playboy interview. I don't know if you've heard of that periodical before. But they used to interview people, among other things. And they interviewed Trump. This is in 1990. And he's complaining about Japan. And it's a very interesting complaint. First of all, he's saying they screw us. They take advantage of us. They're ripping us off. Language he's used very commonly now. And it's all about Japan. He says, first of all, they take our money with their consumer goods. So they're selling all this stuff and taking our money. They sell us cars. They sell us radio equipment and consumer electronics, and they're taking our money. And then they take that money, and what do? They don't buy U.S. goods. They buy real estate in the United States. Or they buy assets in the U.S. So he viewed both sides as being bad for the U.S. They're taking our money, and then they're buying our assets. So they're taking our jobs, and then they take our assets too. That's his view of trade. Now we can get into where this mentality came from, and the mentality of a business person is very different than that of an economist. Okay, I think one of the themes you probably heard many times is mutual gains, a positive sum game, not zero sum. But if you're in the business world, if it's a real estate deal, who gets the building? One person gets it, other people who have bid do not. If you're in the casino business, who's the winner and who's the loser? Is there a loser? Do both sides benefit? Well, in some sense, if you enjoy gambling and you don't mind losing money, you're a winner. But from the standpoint of the owner of the casino, you take the money and they're losing. They're paying. So it's a win-loss proposition. And certainly if you're paying out as the casino owner more than you're taking in, that doesn't work. So whether it's that mentality that's driving him, I don't know, but his views on trade have been set a long time ago. So that means if you're an economic advisor of his today, and you're trying to tell him that he might be wrong about something, he's had these views for 40 years, and you're not going to convince him otherwise. That's his own handwriting, as reported in a book by Bob Woodward. Trade is bad. Now, what did I spend an hour and a half talking about yesterday? How it's good. Does the president believe that? No. Trade is bad. And he wrote that, and gets into this, he had just been at a G20 summit, and of course everyone at the G20 is saying how great globalization is, and he just said this is BS. Trade is bad. It's a way other countries take advantage of the U.S. That's his view. It says, though he never said it in a speech, he had finally found the summarizing phrase and truest expression of his protectionism, isolationism, and fervent American nationalism. That sort of sums it up. So these are some representative quotes with which you've probably heard. We've been ripped off for decades. every country on earth has been ripping off the US. And if he can say that Canada's ripping us off, he might at some point say Israel's ripping the US off too. Because he's saying, the US, we have subsidized Canadians forever. And the US to some extent has been subsidizing Israel to some extent. So if you think you're immune and you've got a special relationship, be wary. And we're not going to let that happen any longer. Trade wars are good and easy to win. That's funny because economists would say exactly the opposite. Trade wars are bad and easy to lose. You're not going to emerge a winner from that. And then we get to tariffs. So those things that have been brought down to very low levels, he wants them much higher. Tariffs are going to be the greatest thing we've ever done as a country. It's going to make our country rich again. Because for some reason, you go back in that history, we had those really high tariffs. He thinks we were richer back then. He thinks we were better off back then. He often talks about the late 19th century. He says we've never been richer. Hard to know exactly what he means by that, because in terms of per capita income, of course, we're much better off. But in terms of the government balancing its books or what have you, things were different back then. Tariffs are the greatest thing ever invented. The most beautiful word in the dictionary is the word tariff. He said it's even prettier than the word love, although he later retracted that. And here he says a tariff is a tax on a foreign country. He says a lot of people say it's a tax on us. No, it doesn't affect our country. If we tax Canadian goods coming in, it's a tax on Canada. If we tax Chinese goods coming in, it's a tax on China. They pay the tax, not us. And he says we're going to shift from internal revenue to external revenue. We're not going to tax ourselves anymore. We're going to tax other countries. So before we get into what he's doing now and assessing it, let's talk about what he did during his first term. And I would argue this. What he did during his first term is a very misleading indicator of what he's doing now. What's different between the first term and the second term?
Back, stuff of the things he do, he needs to do better to America, because he wants the vote to vote him again. But now he doesn't afraid because this is the last time he can do president.
Well, maybe the last time. He might want to do that, but that's partly it, maybe. Yep.
Me?
That's it. Okay.
He didn't think he would get elected the first time. This time he knew he would get elected, and he was prepared.
Okay, he was unprepared the first time. That's partly it. Absolutely.
He was more specific towards certain industries in the policy, in third personality compared to the current one.
Yep. Time to think. Yep.
He surrounded himself with more competent people the first time.
I think that's an important one. That because he didn't expect to be elected in some sense, he wasn't really prepared. He brought in establishment Republicans who sort of like that old idea of low tariffs and freer trade. He didn't, so there's constant battles within the White House about that. Now, those people telling him, let's not do that, or they're gone. And they say, yes, Mr. President, let's do this. So the first term, he didn't actually do that much with respect to trade. So he did withdraw the U.S. from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which both Democratic and Republican presidents had supported in the past. George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Mitt Romney, Mike Pence, all thought, yes, this is American leadership in Asia. It's a way of boxing out China. This is something we ought to do. We're getting other countries to reduce their tariffs. Let's do that. He said that he pulled out very early on. He wanted to pull out of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which links Canada, Mexico, and the United States. He was persuaded not to by some of his advisors. And so he decided to renegotiate it, which basically preserved what NAFTA had been, made very little changes to it. So that means continuity. He did protect washing machines, solar panels, imposed tariffs. We imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum. We're doing that again in a way. The biggest change, I think, is he took a very tough line with China. Now, the U.S.-China relationship had been deteriorating under George W. Bush and Barack Obama, but none of them dared to put tariffs on China. That was considered a very big step. He did it for a variety of reasons. So that was a big change. And this thing called the World Trade Organization, which we haven't talked very much about, it sort of used to be important, not important anymore. And for various reasons, it's just become almost a defunct organization. So that's what he did. So there's some notions here that things are going to be different, but nothing dramatic. Now, Trump 2.0. Remember, he's only been in office for how long? 2 months. So that's not a lot of time, but a lot has happened. Like 2 years. So 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico. Repeatedly said we're going to impose them, and then he says we're going to wait a month. So it's been postponed a couple of times, but they're looming. 10% tariffs on China, followed by another 10% tariffs on China. This is on top of the 25% tariffs on half of our imports from China before. So now we're up to about 35%. So the previous tariffs just hit half of imports. Now they hit all of them. So tariffs are about 20% plus on China. Closed exemptions on steel tariffs. So all the headlines just in the last 24 hours. I mean, trade news is changing literally day by day in the US. It's not really that new in the sense that we saw in his first term, he imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum. Some exemptions were granted to some countries, but Biden continued with those tariffs, so there's no change with the Biden administration, and now he's closing the loopholes. So they're not really new tariffs, but the loopholes that the European Union, Canada, Mexico, and others exemptions, those have been closed. And he's promised tariffs against the EU. Yes?
Update group on that issue.
Sure, yes.
As you speak, it was announced in Brussels that Trump introduced, as of today, the tariffs worth 28 billion US dollars against the EU, and the EU is announcing countermeasures of 26 billion introduced in 2 steps, April 1, April 13. So that trade war is now going on.
So
but at the same time, the Statistical Office of European Union, Eurostat, published the information about the trade surplus of EU vis-à-vis the US of almost 200 billion euros for 2024.
I see. Yep.
End of update.
Okay. So that's closing those loopholes. A big day, every day is a big day, but a really big day that I'm watching and waiting for is April 2nd, because that's when he's going to announce his plan for reciprocal tariffs. And we'll get into that in a moment. Okay, so you've also seen, yes, sorry.
A lot of those tariffs come, as opposed to tariffs that already been on U.S. products. And a lot of these countries, he said that he will reduce them if the other countries will also reduce their own tariffs on goods coming into their countries. And my question is, do those countries even stand a chance to hold 4 years with these tariffs?
It's going to cause economic difficulty, but they can survive. Yeah. They'll have lower standards of living because, once again, if trade is mutually beneficial, what happens when you pull those countries apart? Both countries will be worse off. There's going to be an imbalance in who's harmed the most. So when the U.S. imposed tariffs on Canada and Canada imposed tariffs on the U.S., who's really going to get hurt there? Canada. Because the U.S. is a very large economy, whereas we're very large for Canada. So we're both going to be worse off, but us much less so than Canada. Okay, so I'm sure you've all seen this news. This is the stock market, the reactions to a lot of these tariff plans. Here's the difference between his first term and his second term. So the first term in blue, stock market went up a huge amount. This is just number of days. Within a year, it's up by like 15, 20% during his first term because he emphasized deregulation and tax cuts. And he's still talking about deregulation and tax cuts less, but there's the tariffs are a bigger item. And you can see that the market has just taken that very negatively. This is what the Wall Street Journal is generally a pro-Trump, pro-Republican newspaper. But even they are calling it the dumbest trade war in history. Because once again, we're starting out by hitting Canada and Mexico. And that's important, we'll get there. Okay, so why is he imposing tariffs? What's the rationale? And this has actually been a little bit difficult for outside observers to sort of discern. So during the campaign and once in office, he said, look, what do tariffs do? They raise revenue. And that's a way we can afford to cut other taxes. We want to reduce internal taxes and increase these external taxes, because who does he say is paying those external taxes? Well, there's a question of what he says versus what the reality is. He says other countries pay that tax. China's paying the tax. Canada will pay the tax. You know, we used to subsidize them, now Canada will pay to enter our market. And so we can rebalance the federal budget that way. Reduce the trade deficit. He hates the trade deficit, so that your figure that you just announced, that's going to get his attention, and he's going to say, we haven't hit Europe hard enough. They're taking advantage of us. They're selling more to us than they're buying from us. And that's an imbalanced relationship, and that's wrong. We'll get to that in a moment. Reshore manufacturing production and create jobs. China's taking our jobs. Europe's taking our jobs. Every other country is taking our jobs. Mexico. And so we want those jobs back. We want to produce more cars in the US, more steel in the US, all these things. That's another purpose of the tariffs. And then reciprocity. I'm just trying to get a better deal. Other countries have been taking advantage of us. They charge us high tariffs to enter their markets. We charge low tariffs. That's not fair. We're going to get rid of that by putting on the high tariffs. So these are all the claims about what the policy is going to be. And so let's sort of assess them a little bit. Oh, but tariffs are so good, he likes tariffs so much, they can cut child care costs in the United States. I don't know exactly how, but that's the claim. It's really a magic bullet in Trump's eyes. Okay, revenue. Can we rebalance the federal budget and our tax system by taxing trade more and income less? Well, right now, because tariffs are at a very low level, they raise about 2% of the federal government's revenue. So it's a very small share. So if you want to cut income taxes or corporate taxes, you'd have to raise a lot of revenue from tariffs to make that up. What's the problem with that?
The pie will get smaller. So in other words, because the trade will be smaller, so maybe you'll have a larger percent, but a smaller pie.
Okay, so trade will contract, tariffs will contract GDP, so you're getting more from a smaller pie. So the U.S. has a big fiscal deficit, as you probably know. It's probably 6% of GDP, perhaps something like that, which is astronomically high when the economy is doing pretty well, the unemployment rate is low. What are imports as a share of GDP? I wouldn't expect you to know this. Most Americans don't know it. It's about 14% of GDP. Actually, that's goods and services. So if it's just goods, it's about 11% of GDP. If you have a budget deficit of 6% of GDP and imports, which is the tax base, is 11% of GDP, can you extract 6% of GDP in revenue from 11%? No. That's a very small tax base. What's the share of personal income in the US as a share of GDP? It's very large. It's like 80% of GDP. So that's the tax base that you're levying the taxes on versus imports that are small. By the way, what happens to imports when you tax them? They shrink. So are you going to be able to get much revenue by taxing imports? Not if they disappear. Why doesn't personal income disappear when it's taxed? You still got to work. Okay, you may not like it. It's a disincentive, but people are still going to work. So basically, it's impossible to balance the federal budget or to certainly cut income taxes in any appreciable degree and make it all up with tariffs, because the imports will just disappear. So that's not really going to work. There's the question of who pays the tariff too. We'll get to that momentarily. Reduce the trade deficit. So I got the feedback from yesterday that some people want a little more technical material. So how about this? Do you want to go over this? Do you want to do draw some diagrams? Does anyone know what this is? Oh, you've seen it before. Good. Okay, what does it say? Yep, is
Equals savings minus investments.
exactly. Is this a theory? No, it's an accounting identity. So the trade balance is determined by domestic savings and domestic investment and the imbalance between them. Now you can break out savings and investment into what? Two components. Private savings and investment and public savings and investment. And public savings and investment is the fiscal deficit, if you will, dis savings. What is all this saying is that, do you see tariffs in there? Do you see unfair trade practices? Do you see efficiency? No. If you are a low-saving country with a great deal of investment, what do we know ipso facto is going to be your trade balance? Negative. Negative. Is the U.S. a high savings or a low savings country? Low savings, high consumption. Is China a high savings or a low savings country? High savings. Now, you could ask China to change its policies, which would have an impact on the U.S. trade deficit, but what do you think is the biggest component here to the trade deficit in some sense? What did we talked about on the right-hand side? T, what is T? Taxes. G is what? What could the U.S. do if it doesn't like the fact that it has a trade deficit? Or increase taxes, balance the federal budget. It's called the twin deficit hypothesis, and the fact is that there's a correlation between what's going on with the fiscal deficit and what's going on with the trade deficit. So tariffs don't really enter in here. It's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to balance the trade with tariffs. Here's some studies. Let's just do the theory first. Now, if we tax imports and imports shrink, why wouldn't the trade deficit go down? Okay, so it's exports minus imports. We're exporting a little, we're importing a lot. We tax imports, so imports go down. Why won't that balance trade? Why would exports go down?
There's tariffs on you, and also you have less money to buy.
And what does that do? Affect exports. We have less money, we're spending less money on foreign goods. What happens? The dollar appreciates. When the dollar appreciates with the U.S. tariffs, that keeps down U.S. exports too. So you might think if imports went down and exports stayed the same, maybe it would work. In fact, under fixed exchange rates with no retaliation, it might work. But we don't have those two things. We have floating exchange rates, so the dollar is going to rise in value, price out U.S. exports, so exports will go down, and other countries will retaliate and suppress U.S. exports, and the gap is determined by capital inflows, and that doesn't necessarily change with the tariffs. In fact, if Trump's plan worked, the trade deficit would go up. Because if we impose tariffs and everyone says we got to invest in manufacturing in the United States now, that'd be a lot of capital inflows in the United States, and the trade deficit would get larger because that gap between savings and investment would be larger. So the bottom line is, we can spend a whole class or more on this, tariffs won't reduce the trade deficit. We just talked about the theory. Here's the sort of evidence. The macroeconomy after tariffs is a comprehensive study of what happens when countries impose tariffs. What do they find? An insignificant change to the trade balance. All these countries over time, when they change the tariffs, they don't really change the trade balance. Peterson Institute for International Economics, fiscal and exchange rate policy, not tariffs, can reduce the trade deficit. So we could say, President Trump, you're right. Trade deficit is a bad thing. We want to reduce it. What we should do is reduce U.S. fiscal spending, cut the budget deficit, and that will naturally ease pressure on the U.S. dollar. Less capital inflows, less borrowing from abroad, the trade deficit would go down. So that's a question not of questioning what the goal is, it's what's the instrument to achieve that goal. Tariffs won't help you so much there. So it's not really going to reduce the trade deficit. How about reshoring manufacturing production and creating jobs? Here is the share of employment in the United States in manufacturing since 1940. So you can see the World War II blip there. And what's happened since 1945? It's going in one direction. What would Trump's explanation for this be? Globalization, trade, everyone's taking our jobs. What's the economist's explanation for why this is going on?
Yeah, technologies go in, so it's more cheaping to do everything outside America, and in America we are more efficient.
I would emphasize the efficiency rather than the outsourcing, but yes? Yep.
America has a relative advantage in other, not specifically in manufacturing, but maybe in other stuff like IT.
Okay. So in fact, where are all these workers going?
And the services, what they have a relative
If I showed you this picture from 1800 to 1950, 1800 to 1950, but I said, oh, it's agriculture, how would it look different? It would look exactly the same. In 1800, what was everyone in America doing? Farming, agriculture. And in 1950, what were we doing? We weren't doing, actually, what was happening to agricultural output? Going up. What was happening to the share of the labor force in agriculture? It's collapsing. Why? How can you get more output with fewer people? You know the answer, exactly. The same things happened here. We're producing more manufactured goods, not less, but with fewer workers because we're using better technology, we're using capital equipment, we're not using just labor. What about trade agreements? Well, there's NAFTA. Mexico's taking our jobs. Do you see a big change in the trend as a result of before and after NAFTA? No. That trend has been pre-existing for decades beforehand. How about China? That's when China joined the WTO. Actually, you can see it goes down a little bit more, but it didn't really change much. And since the global financial crisis, it's flattened out. And actually, why is it flattened out? This is very interesting. There's been very little growth in manufacturing productivity in the last 20 years in American manufacturing. So in other words, what is the way, if we want to stop the decline in the share of the labor force in manufacturing, what do we have to do? Stop technological change and not become more efficient. And then it flattens out as it has been. So there's a trade-off. Do you want to become really more productive and efficient, or do you want the jobs? Has Milton Friedman come up? His name? You know who he is? He went to India once. I think there's a famous story. And he saw people building a road. And they were using shovels, 100 people, 200 people with shovels digging the road. And he said, why are you using shovels? Why don't you use a tractor? And they said, well, if we used a tractor, then we wouldn't employ all these people. And he said, oh, I thought you were building a road. I didn't know you were trying to employ people. Why don't you give them spoons? Then you need twice as number of people to build the road. They didn't quite get that, but that's sort of what the idea is. You can have the jobs, you can have the technology, but not both. This is the steel industry. This is an example of how it's been technology, not imports, that have been destroying jobs. Steel production. In 1980, it took 10 worker hours to produce a ton of steel. 10 worker hours. Today, it takes 1 worker hour to produce a ton of steel. And the types of jobs has changed. In 1980, do you know Bruce Springsteen? Okay, he sings a lot of songs about New Jersey and manufacturing and stuff like that. He thinks of blue-collar workers, moving this stuff around, making steel. That's not the way steel is made anymore. We're still making a lot of steel in the US, but it's people like you. It's engineers and technicians monitoring equipment, not physically making things. Here's steel production versus consumption. Why isn't the steel industry booming in the US? This is going back to 1914. 1914 to 1970, it's going like this. What's going on since? It's flat. We're just not consuming as much steel anymore. It's not as though consumption is rising and production is going down and imports are making up the gap. Yeah, there's some imports in there, but It's mainly, we're not buying as much steel. We don't need it. And if you have producing the same amount, you just need fewer workers. That's why we have fewer workers in the steel industry. Where do we get our steel from? Because this is what he's focused on. This is the new tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and others today. Steel. Most of our steel comes from Canada and Mexico, Brazil. China actually is pretty low on the list because they've already been hit with what are known as anti-dumping duties. We already hit them with tariffs going way back. Aluminum, we get almost all of our aluminum from Canada. So it's not exactly we're hitting our enemies with these tariffs, we're hitting our friends. And of course, there's Taiwan, South Korea, Germany, Japan, and others down that list too. So that's why the European Union is upset. Canada's upset and it is retaliating. Who pays these tariffs? Is Canada going to pay the tariffs? Is EU? No, steel prices go up. When you impose a tariff, the price goes up. And it's not the other country that's getting that, it's the federal government. So it's the consumers that are paying those higher prices that are paying the government. So domestic prices are going up. And here's another reason why trade won't reshore jobs. This is the previous Commerce Secretary in the first term. When they imposed steel tariffs the first time, he said, look, here's a can of soup. How much steel and aluminum is in this? Pennies. The tariffs are not really going to increase this product's price. No one's going to feel the impact of the tariffs. No one's going to, consumers will pay 1 penny more for a can of soup. No one will notice, but it will help the steel industry. Okay, maybe that's true, but what about Ford Motor Company? Does Ford buy a lot of steel? Yes. Do you go out and buy steel? No, I don't go out and buy a steel girder. It's costing them $1 billion in extra costs. Ford has to pay that for the steel for its cars. Guess who doesn't have to pay that tax? Any foreign automaker that's not producing in the US. If you're producing in Mexico or Canada or Japan or Korea, you don't have to pay that inflated cost for your steel. You now have a cost advantage, and you can sell into the market that way. What company is this? John Deere. What is this? Exactly. That's about as specific as I think as a combine, but it's something for farming. Do you use a lot of steel in producing this? Absolutely. Your costs are going up. And once again, do you face foreign competition? This firm, John Deere? Can you make tractors anywhere else but the United States? Of course you can. And if you don't have to pay the inflated costs on your inputs, you're going to do that. What company is this? Caterpillar. Is there a lot of steel in that? Yep. Who's Caterpillar competing against? Have you ever heard of Komatsu? No? Okay, well, they make the same thing in Japan. They don't have to pay 25% on their steel. Does that give Komatsu a cost advantage? Absolutely. And so that hurts. Honda shifted production of SUVs from the US to China to avoid those tariffs. Here's why these tariffs don't save jobs. You may gain jobs in the steel industry, but you're going to lose them in downstream industries that pay inflated costs. So 30,000 jobs in iron and steel, but fabricated metals, motor vehicles, and transport equipment, you're going to lose jobs there. State and local governments in the United States, they want to build new bridges. They want to replace old bridges. What does it take to build a bridge? Steel. What happens to the cost of your budget? It's going to go up. And what does that mean? Either higher taxes or you got to squeeze something else. So there's always going to be something that's going to be paid. American college campuses, this is very important. They're not sophisticated students like you. They're very young kids. And what do? They go to college to drink. And what do you need to drink? You need a keg. What's happening to the cost of kegs? Well, there's one manufacturer of kegs in Wisconsin that's had to lay off workers because they're not internationally competitive anymore. Alcoa, warning that they're going to lose 100,000 jobs as a result of aluminum tariffs because they need aluminum inputs that we get from Canada that are now going to be more expensive. So I could go on, but the bottom line is it's very difficult to create more jobs in manufacturing through tariffs, because a lot of manufactured products are inputs to production elsewhere, and you may save jobs in one sector, but you lose them elsewhere, and it's just a rebalancing. How about reciprocity? So there was that complaint that other countries charge the US a lot, and US tariffs are very low. Here are some examples he's holding up of apples in Japan. Foreign tariff is 17%, US tariff is 0. We don't know exactly what this is going to be, because it will be announced April 2nd. Mark that in your calendar. April 2nd, a big announcement is coming about, and what he says is, if other countries charge us, we're going to charge them. So our tariffs are going to go up. Let's see if I have it here. Oh, here's an article in the Wall Street Journal. Reciprocal tariffs make no sense. Who wrote that? I did. So if you want to know more about it, just Google that and read it. Here's some examples. First of all, other countries really don't charge the US so much as we think. The average European Union tariff against the US, 5%. Average US tariff against the EU, 4%. So we're talking about 1%. Okay. Now, of course, different products. If we really want other countries to be equal with us, 2 points on that. First of all, a lot of other countries have lower tariffs than the US. Would Trump's plan reduce US tariffs to match those foreign tariffs? No. What does Japan charge on imported automobiles? What's the tariff? 0. What's the US tariff on Japanese cars? 2.5%. Are tariffs determining which way the cars go? Well, guess what? If an American manufacturer wants to sell in Japan, where do you have to put the steering wheel? On the right. Do US producers do that? No. Why bother? So do Japanese buy American cars? No. How about big trucks? President Trump said they don't buy our big pickup trucks. Well, if you tried to drive one of those in Ireland down the road, you'd take up both lanes. It's obvious why. New Zealand, dairy. What does New Zealand charge imported dairy products? First of all, does New Zealand produce a lot of dairy or a little? Yes, a lot. So guess what the tariff is? 0, because they don't need it. They have a lot of sheep and a lot of cows and what have you. What's our dairy tariff in the US? Really high. Would we reduce ours on New Zealand? Of course not, because the farmers in Wisconsin would object. So at any rate, another point, if you really want reciprocal fair trade, what sort of agreement might you want? Pardon me?
I will give you this for zero tariff, and you will reciprocate for zero
tariff. How about 0 on both sides? Doesn't that sound great? Does the US have that with any country in the world? Oh, yes, we do. Israel being one of them. But who else do we have 0 tariffs? Pardon me?
Used to be Canada and Mexico.
Canada and Mexico. But is he complaining about lack of reciprocity there?
Yeah.
Absolutely. So you can have 0 on both sides, but you're still going to get complaints from the US. Because, pardon me?
There are no tariffs from Canada to the United States?
Yep. It's a free trade agreement. We have free trade agreements with Chile. We have free trade agreements with Peru. We have free trade agreements with Israel. We have a free trade agreement with Jordan. We have a free trade agreement with Australia. We have a free trade agreement with Canada, Mexico. There's still complaints because he doesn't judge it by the tariffs. He judges it by the trade balance. If you're exporting more to the US than you're buying from us, that's unfair trade because that's imbalanced. So the tariffs is a bit of a sideshow. Okay, so what are some of the problems with, so what I'm trying to suggest to you is these are all complaints. We can accept the complaints. Maybe we do want to reduce the trade deficit. Maybe we do want to create more manufacturing jobs. Maybe we want to have a more balanced, fair trade relationship with other countries. The question is, are tariffs going to help us achieve that objective? Or are other things that we should be doing? Well, here are some of the problems with tariffs. They're not really paid, why qualify it? They're not paid by other countries, they're paid by US consumers. And there are a couple of problems with that. It's a regressive tax and it raises the cost for US businesses. So for example, first of all, consumers know this. They know this. If we tax imports from Canada, they know we know we're going to pay higher prices. I'll give you a very personal example of that in just a moment. But it's interesting, the Secretary of the Treasury says, you know what? Low prices, cheap goods, that's not what the American dream is all about. But the problem is, guess what? If your income is fixed and prices go up, what's happened to your real income? Goes down. So there is something to this idea that actually cheap goods, which are produced efficiently, that's why they're cheap, is part of the American dream. Here is the consumer price. So we have evidence from the first term when tariffs were imposed. If we're talking about it speculatively, we can always guess, oh, if we impose this, no one will pay the price. But we actually did impose tariffs in the first term, and what do we see? And the red line is 9 tariff-impacted categories. Guess what? Tariffs go in, prices go up. The price of other goods continue to go down. All sorts of academic studies. These are on goods from China affected or unaffected by these tariffs, and look what's happening to those prices of the affected goods. They're going up 20%, which is what the tariffs were. Okay, instantaneously. There's no lagged adjustment. You impose that tax, boom, the prices go up. Laundry equipment, so washing machines and dryers. Tariffs were imposed, you're off the trend. Prices go up. Warren Buffett. This is what he says. The tooth fairy doesn't pay the tariff. American consumers paying the tariff. It's regressive. I don't know how much you care about fairness or what have you, but if the price of a washing machine goes up by 20%, is that going to cost a billionaire very much? Is that going to cost a millionaire very much? But what if you're right at the margin of poverty? That's going to be huge. And so when you look at income deciles or quintiles, the lowest income groups are going to bear more of the burden in terms of a share of their income of those tariffs. And when you look at tax cuts, which are sort of skewed towards higher income individuals because they pay more, the tariff is negative, regressive like that. Retaliation. I'll get to the personal story in a moment. Retaliation. What's interesting is during his first term, Peter Navarro, who's one of the presidential advisors on trade, said, no country's going to retaliate. We're too big and powerful. That was his prediction. But of course, we heard the news, and we also saw last time other countries did retaliate. In fact, here's from the Washington Post just the other day. China, Mexico, Canada going to retaliate. Before, this is from the European Union, but this is from the first term. This is Jean-Claude Juncker, the commissioner for the EU, saying, we all can also do stupid. Okay, we have to impose these tariffs. It's basically a stupid process. The fact we have to do it, but we'll do it. We'll impose tariffs on motorcycles, Harley Davidsons, blue jeans, bourbon. We can also be stupid. So you impose the tariffs, we're going to impose tariffs too. China, of course, doesn't even bother to make these announcements. They just retaliate. They just hit back immediately. One example of this is sorghum boat. This is from the first term. It's a boat with sorghum. What's sorghum? It's a grain. That's about all I know too. Okay. And guess where it's going? It was going to China. There are trackers on the internet. You can track every ship. Okay. So it's leaving, I think, someplace now the Gulf of America, I think in Texas, and it was going to China. And guess what happened? China retaliated against U.S. agricultural exports for the tariffs. So the tariffs on sorghum went up. So what did the boat do? Mid-journey, it stopped and turned around because it said, we're not going to offload this in China because it's going to be too expensive. And so where are we going to go? We're going to go to Europe and sell the sorghum there. Guess what happened when they get to Europe? The EU had also imposed tariffs on sorghum. So eventually the boat headed back to the US. That's that effect on exports where you're not making that export sale. Here's soybean prices between Brazil and the US. This is going back to 2018. Other countries retaliated against US farm exports. The price of Brazilian soybeans soars. The price of US soybeans falls. Explain that to me.
What is the logic of other
putting on tariff and being stupid?
That's a great question. So if one country's imposing tariffs on you, you have basically two options. Option number one is do nothing. Saying, okay, you like those tariffs, but either we can't affect your behavior, we're not going to drive trade down more, it's just going to hurt our consumers, we'll just, nothing we can do about it. But the idea behind China and the EU and other countries, and even Canada and Mexico to some extent, is twofold. First of all, we are going to inflict a cost on you too, and we're going to do it in a very strategic way in the sense that what did Jean-Claude Juncker say they're going to tax? What commodities? Blue jeans. Why blue jeans?
American products.
Of course, American products. Yep. It's just to get US. What was the first item? Harley Davidsons. Why?
Very significant with
symbol.
culture.
It's a symbol, but it's produced in Pennsylvania. And they're trying to influence representatives in Congress in Pennsylvania. It's also produced in Wisconsin, and in whose district at this time, Paul Ryan, who I think was the Speaker of the House. So in his district, there's a Harley Davidson plant, and if you're hitting that plant, you're hitting his workers directly, making him pay a political price for supporting the president. The other ones are agricultural commodities, produced in the Midwest, which, first of all, why would you hit agricultural commodities? This gets to the point of retaliation. What sort of retaliation do you want? Something that will inflict harm on the other guy, but not affect you very much. So what's going on here? So if you don't buy US soybeans,
You have enough in Europe.
exactly. Are you dependent on Harley Davidson for motorcycles? No. Soybeans, these are commodities. So you don't buy from the US, that's why the price is going down. And everyone's buying Brazilian, so the price is going up. So actually going back to Adam Smith talks about retaliation, and he says, don't know which way it goes, but he said, first of all, he says there's a lot of economic nationalism in countries. So if you're the Prime Minister of Canada, could you say, look, if we retaliate, it's just going to make our economy worse, make you pay more? Can you survive politically by saying that? Maybe, but if people are angry, they want to hear, they might want to elect someone who's going to fight back. And you're willing to bear a price to inflict a price on another country. Okay, let me just, so we impose these tariffs on China. We get this revenue, okay, which is supposedly so we can cut other taxes. Where does all this revenue go? It went to farm payments to American farmers to compensate them for their lost sales as a result of retaliation against US exports. So that's another reason why the illusion that you're going to get a lot of revenue from tariffs. Well, you get some revenue, but if you have to spend it all on farmers to compensate them for lost export markets, you're not using that for the general fund. You can't really cut taxes overall. So there's this idea about socialism. It's a government handout, tax relief from tariffs, and this farmer's saying, no, we don't want that. That's socialism. And guess what? They're quite happy to take it because their income is going down otherwise. So anyway, let's talk about Canada for a moment, because this is the most odd aspect in some sense about this recent trade war. If he had been just hitting China, I would not have said a peep, and I would have gone over it and say that's geopolitics, and there are national security reasons for doing that, for banning TikTok or what have you, and no problem. We said, what did Adam Smith say yesterday? Defense is more important than opulence, okay? So we don't do that. But this is Canada, and there are a lot of tweets against Canada saying we subsidize them, first of all, hundreds of billions of dollars. We don't need anything they have. We have unlimited energy. We should make our own cars. We have more lumber than we could ever use. If we have more lumber than we could ever use, why are we importing so much from Canada? Why do we get almost a lot of our aluminum from Canada? Massive subsidy. It would cease to exist as a viable country. Harsh but true. It should be the 51st state, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, here he says, we're subsidizing them hundreds of billions of dollars. Another treaty, it's just $100,000 a year. So the numbers change a bit. It's not even clear how exactly the subsidy is. 51st state. This is from the Canadians, but in terms of energy, the perception in the US is, oh, we get a lot of oil from Saudi Arabia. That's why we have to be nice to the Saudis. But the reality is actually we don't buy so much from the Saudis. We still care about them because they have influenced the world price, but we get a lot of our energy from Canada because it's just next door. This is a notice I got. So first of all, if you think about the US, I live in the north. I'm about a 2-hour drive from Montreal, in northern New England, a state called New Hampshire. It's just north of Boston. As soon as the tariffs hit, I got an email from our propane provider, Irving Energy, which happens to be a Canadian company. I didn't know that. Basically saying, your propane prices are going to go up by the extent of the tariff. If the US imposes these tariffs of 10 or 25% on energy coming in from Canada, we can't absorb that. We're going to pass that along to you. So who's paying that tariff? I am. Guess what? I'm a professor. Can I afford to pay that? Fortunately, I can. But guess what? There are other people in neighboring towns that are not nearly as well off. And it's very cold where I live. Can they afford it? There, the choice is, do we eat or do we pay our energy bill? That's a tougher choice. That's the regressive nature. What is this? It is potash. And what do you use potash for? Yes, it's a fertilizer. Guess where the US gets almost all of its potash? Canada. If farmers are paying inflated, not only getting hit on the export side, but now they have to pay higher costs for potash, you have to subsidize them on that too. This is spreading potash. It's hitting farmers once again. President Trump says Canada's cheating on dairy. They have these high tariffs. Wait a second. I thought we said we had a free trade agreement. 0 tariffs on each side. Canada's charging these really high tariffs. No, it is true. Because the 0 tariffs on about 99% of the goods flowing across the border. But each country has its own carve-outs. The sugar industry in the United States is very powerful. We don't have free trade with Mexico or Canada with sugar. So like for any agreement, you have exceptions. And so Canada charges those high tariffs. But guess what? The US does the same thing. We charge high dairy tariffs on Canada too. So that's where, are you really cared about fairness? Yes, Canada has those. And first of all, this is in the USMCA agreement that the Trump administration negotiated in its first term. It knew this. It was accepting that Canada was going to impose those tariffs because Canada was accepting US high tariffs too. So it's sort of just an odd thing. If you didn't like that, take it out from the previous negotiation. But now we're going to impose 25% tariffs on everything because of the high dairy tariffs. So I'm trying to understand, first of all, Canada has been our friend. We have a relatively unpoliced border, a peaceful border of thousands of miles. We get along with them very well. We go up there for vacations, they come down. We've had this trading relationship for so long. 9/11, they sent troops to fight with us in Afghanistan and Iraq. World War II. Why are we doing this to Canada? There is no one in the Congress, or I dare say the administration, or among the American people who think Canada is a problem for the US. But one person does. And our system is so powerful, that one person can drive policy. And that person is the person on the right. And the question is, why does he not like Canada so much? I don't know. But there's a personal animus here that goes way beyond the actual stakes of the relationship. And maybe it's because Justin's a pretty good looking guy who happened to kiss Melania on the cheek once. I don't know. Here's a cartoon on this relationship. Justin won't be around for very long. Is this popular in the US? Is people saying, yes, strike back at Canada? 12%. 12% say yes. And what else does it say? 3 in 10 Republicans strongly supported the tariff. So even Republicans, which are very pro-Trump, 3 in 10 support the tariffs, not This is not, there's not some nationalist surge in the US saying we've got to go after Canada and Mexico. The Mexico issue, first of all, you know, he was very much demonized Mexico during the first term, but now it's all directed at Canada. I can understand we have much more problems with Mexico. So, you know, there could be a focus there, but it's not, he's not bringing it up very much. I could have shown you the picture of him talking to the president of Mexico, a woman, Claudia, I can't remember her name, who apparently they get along pretty well. So what's happened is American foreign policy and American trade policy used to be based on relationships that crossed administrations and was based on national interest, and now it's based on transactions and personal relationships. And so that's a very different thing. Retaliation, let's see. Tax cuts, you know, they were going to promote growth, but all the gains are going to be reduced by trade. So that gets to the size of the pie. Deregulation and lower taxes will expand the pie, but you're actually with foreign retaliation, the whole thing is collapsing. Trouble with tariffs, this is JP Morgan, their analysis. Trouble with tariffs, to be succinct, is that they raise prices, slow economic growth, cut profits, increase unemployment, worsen inequality, diminish productivity, increase global tensions. Other than that, they're fine. So that's a major investment back in the US in their assessment. Here's a paper I wrote in his first term. It's an Trump trade policy, an exercise in futility, because it's not going to achieve the objectives that the president wants. It won't reduce the trade deficit. It won't bring back manufacturing jobs. It's not going to lead to better trade agreements. It risks retaliation to the detriment of exports. And I have a paper that just came out in Foreign Affairs you can read called The Incoherent Case for Tariffs. Yes?
This slide, one slide. The second bullet point, you say will not bring back manufacturing jobs. And I'm just wondering, we were discussing so far that the country-to-country response. Is that, in your view, we are going to get some different picture if we will involve micro level, meaning responses of companies? And what I mean specifically is that within this situation, many European companies today are making public declarations about moving their production facilities to the US. We don't know if that will happen, but if they will start moving there, that will be the trend. Will not that be the game changer and the big victory for Trump?
Possibly, but once again, you're raising as many, if you impose tariffs indiscriminately, you're going to get some final goods producers who will move in.
But if you're dependent on imported intermediate goods, it's going to raise your costs and make you less efficient. So, you know, you could always, through targeted tariffs or subsidies, you know, get the relocation of some industries. But just raising the wall overall, because so much of U.S. imports are intermediate goods, it's that's where this washes. So we'll sort of have to see. The steel industry is a clear case where we actually lost jobs on net, because you get them in the steel industry, but you lose them in the downstream industries. How much that'll be replicated, we'll just have to see. But that would be a glimmer of hope. I think I'm just about out of time. Let's see if there's another slide or two or not. No. So questions. Let's go to questions. Yes.
I think maybe, you know, obviously on an economic point of view, tariffs would probably hurt the economy, will it hurt the economy? But I think the bigger picture that we should be looking at is that he's looking at it not as an economist, right? He's looking at it as a businessman. And as a businessman, he said, my bigger problem is not the whole financial things. His bigger problem is the drugs coming in from Canada and the whole cartels thing and the illegal immigration going into the United States. So if you look at it from that point of view, I mean, I don't know if he will succeed from that. He might be achieving his goals, you know, if he doesn't destroy his economy on the, you know, in the meantime. So my question is here, like, how what is the possibility this other country, like, it goes back to my last one, I just didn't really get an answer, is that what is the possibility that they will not, you know, go back and, you know, say, okay, we do whatever with, you know, put our heads down into the United States and, you know, give Trump everything he wants.
That's certainly the hope that this is a threat to achieve a very specific end. Here again, though, there's this odd focus on Canada as opposed to Mexico. So you're right, the rationale for those 25% tariffs was not anything to do with trade directly, but fentanyl flows and migrant flows. Fentanyl is not flowing across the US-Canadian border. Last year they got like 40 pounds. 40 pounds. You know how much is coming across the southern border? A lot more. So there's a disproportionate response against Canada as opposed to Mexico. That's why I said we have many more problems with Mexico, but you want to work on it in a cooperative way. And if you don't get the cooperation, then you could, you might be actually be able to, beat up on the cartels through some of these policies. But also migrant flows. Migrants are flowing from the U.S. into Canada. Canada could complain about, people moving into Canada rather than the other way around. And once again, it's the southern border where there has been that migration flow that's the issue. So, yeah.
Trump very often uses a lot of high words, and to continue the question, he basically uses it as a threat, as a leverage, to get policy and to create relationships that he wants. So to very much use it to get out Justin Trudeau, to use it as his ultimate goal is not to put the tariff. His ultimate goal is to use it to get what he wants. That's basically his use. And I would say that for that mechanism, you could say that the tariff can be quite an effective tool.
So if you really want to bring back the jobs, you can't use it as sort of this bargaining tool.
Not what he wants. He wants to get out Justin Trudeau. He wants to restrict China, as it's not his main goal.
So that's sort of the issue then. He says there are 10 reasons to impose these tariffs, and we're all trying to divine which is the real reason. And getting back to the better deal, when we say, Mexico and Canada have to be tougher on the border, basically because he's, I hate to say this, ill-informed, they say what they're doing. And he says, oh, okay, the tariffs will come off. In other words, they don't do anything more. They just say, well, we're going to move troops to the border. Well, the troops were already moved to the border before the threats. So he's getting a deal in some sense, but the deal was already done. So it's not clear what the big gain is. And yet, if it's getting retaliation and breeding ill will, it's destroying a relationship that's going to be less cooperative when you actually need that cooperation on other things. So let's continue the discussion at the break in lunch.